The grand office of the Mafia King was filled with the scent of expensive cigars and the sound of silence heavy and suffocating. KIMTAEHYUNG sat behind his sleek mahogany desk, the picture of dominance. At 30, he was untouchable, his reputation for being ruthless preceding him. He wore a crisp black suit, the silver cufflinks glinting under the dim chandelier light. A knock echoed through the room, but Taehyung didn't bother to look up from the paperwork in front of him. "Come in," he ordered, his deep voice sending chills down anyone who heard it. One of his men stepped inside, bowing slightly. "Boss, Mr. Kim wants to see you. He says it's urgent." Taehyung finally looked up, his sharp eyes narrowing. "If it's another lecture about my responsibilities, I'm not interested. He said it's non-negotiable," the man added hesitantly. Taehyung let out a low growl of frustration, pushing his chair back. "Fine, let's get this over with." In the spacious Kim family library, Mr. Kim stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring out the window. Taehyung entered, his presence commanding even in his father's domain. "What is it now?" Taehyung asked, his tone laced with annoyance. Mr. Kim turned, his expression grave. "You're getting married," Taehyung blinked, then let out a bitter laugh. "Married to whom? And why would I agree to this ridiculous idea?" To Lee Wyon, Mr. Kim said firmly, "It's Mr. Lee's dying wish. He's been my best friend for decades, and I owe him this." "I don't care about his wishes or your debt of gratitude," Taehyung snapped. "I'm not marrying anyone, especially not some spoiled heiress." Mr. Kim's eyes hardened. "You will marry her, Taehyung. If you refuse, I'll ensure you lose everything. I'll remove your name from my will, and you'll be left with nothing." Taehyung's jaw clenched, his fury barely contained. "You're using me as a pawn in your little loyalty game. Is that it?" Mr. Kim didn't flinch. "Call it what you want, but this is happening. You'll meet her tomorrow." Introduction to Lee Wyon in the bustling office of Bell's Textile was a hive of activity, with employees rushing to meet deadlines and designers showcasing their latest creations. In the middle of it all stood Lee Wyon, the 27-year-old CEO and fashion mogul. She was dressed in a pristine white blazer with gold accents, her signature red lipstick adding a pop of color to her flawless appearance. "Is this the best you can do?" Wyon asked, holding up a sketch. Her voice was sharp but not unkind. The junior designer fidgeted nervously. I can improve it, Mom." "Good," Wyon said with a small nod. "I expect it on my desk by tomorrow morning." As the designer scurried away, Wyon's assistant approached her cautiously. "Ms. Lee, your father has asked to see you at home. He says it's important." Wyon's confident demeanor softened at the mention of her father. "Cancel my meetings for the rest of the day," she said, already grabbing her coat. Wyon sat beside her father's bed, holding his hand tightly. His once strong grip was now weak, his face pale and tired. "Wyon," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't strain yourself, Dad," she said gently. "I need to tell you something," he continued, ignoring her protest. "I don't have much time left. But before I go, I want to see you settled." Wyon frowned. "Settled? What do you mean?" "I've arranged for you to marry Kim Taehyung," he said, his words shaking her to her core. "Kim Taehyung, the Mafia King?" Wyon asked, disbelief written all over her face. "He's Mr. Kim's son, and he'll take care of you," her father explained. "Dad, I can take care of myself." "You know that." "I know," he said softly. "But this is my final wish." "Wyon, promise me you'll do this." Tears welled up in her eyes as she nodded. "Okay, Dad, I promise." The dimly lit basement of the Kim estate was eerily silent, save for the heavy breathing of a man tied to a chair. Blood dripped from his nose, staining the once pristine marble floor. Kim Taehyung stood in front of him, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored black shirt, his face devoid of any emotion. "Please, I didn't mean to betray you," the man whimpered, his voice trembling. Taehyung let out a cold chuckle, his sharp eyes narrowing. Didn't mean to. You sold my shipment to my rivals and thought I wouldn't find out. Did you think I'm stupid or just blind? No, boss, it was a mistake. Before he could finish, Taehyung grabbed the man's collar and leaned in, his voice a deadly whisper. I don't forgive mistakes, especially ones that cost me millions. He signaled to one of his men, who handed him a gun. Without hesitation, Taehyung cocked it and pressed it against the man's temple. Boss, please, I have a family, the man cried, tears streaming down his face. Taehyung tilted his head, a mockery of empathy flashing across his face. Oh, now you remember your family. Should have thought of them before crossing me. With a smirk, he pulled the trigger. The room fell silent again, as the man slumped lifelessly in the chair. Taehyung handed the gun back to his subordinate and adjusted his jacket. Clean this up, he ordered, his tone icy. I have somewhere to be. Taehyung walked into his penthouse later that evening, his expression still dark. Yeji, his girlfriend, was lounging on the couch in a designer dress, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her phone screen. Taehyung, you're home, she chirped, her voice annoyingly high-pitched. She jumped up and ran to him, wrapping her arms around his neck. I miss you so much today. Taehyung didn't return the embrace, instead prying her arms off him gently but firmly. I had work. Yeji pouted, her lips forming an exaggerated frown. You always have work. When will you make time for me? Taehyung sighed, loosening his tie. Yeji, I'm not in the mood for your games right now. But Tae, she whined, batting her lash, you promised we'd go to Paris next week. I already told my friends, and they're so jealous. He ignored her and walked to the bar, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. Yeji followed, her pout turning into a fake, tearful expression. Do you even care about me, Taehyung, or am I just another accessory for you? Taehyung finally turned to her, his cold gaze silencing her fake sobs. Don't start with the dramatics, Yeji. You and I both know what this relationship is. You get your designer bags and trips, and I get peace when you're not talking. Yeji's eyes widened, her tears now genuine. How can you say that? She cried. Before Taehyung could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression hardening. Mr. Kim's message read, Tell Yeji, the wedding will be public. Yeji noticed the change in his demeanor. What's wrong? She asked, her voice shaky. Taehyung took another sip of his drink before speaking. I'm getting married. Her face went pale. Married to who? Lee Hwa-eun, he said bluntly. But I love you, she wailed, dropping to the floor dramatically. I've been with you through everything. How can you just throw me away? Taehyung crouched down in front of her, his voice surprisingly soft. Stop crying. It's not permanent. I'll marry her, play the dutiful son for a few months, and then divorce her. You'll still have everything you want. Yeji sniffled, looking up at him with hopeful eyes. You promise? He nodded, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. I promise. You know I always keep my word. Despite his words, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, cold, detached, and indifferent. The grand hall was adorned with white roses, golden drapes, and sparkling chandeliers. It was a sight of opulence, as expected of the Kim family. Guests filled the pews, their chatter mixing with the soft melody of a piano in the background. At the far end of the hall stood KIMTAEHYUNG, the epitome of cold perfection in his tailored black tuxedo. He stood at the altar, hands clasped in front of him, his sharp features set in an expression of utter disinterest. To anyone observing, he looked like a man being dragged into a battle rather than the happiest day of his life. The murmur of the crowd grew louder as the grand double doors opened. All heads turned, including Taehyung's, His eyes barely moved to glance toward the entrance before falling back to the floor. Mr. Lee, frail but radiating happiness, stood tall at the door, holding his daughter's hand. His other hand gripped a cane, but he walked with pride. Widen, dressed in an ethereal white gown, walked beside him. Her face was hidden behind a delicate veil, but her regal aura made everyone in the room stop and stare. Taehyung's jaw tightened as the duo made their way down the aisle. He kept his gaze neutral, refusing to show any emotion, though he could feel the weight of the moment settling in his chest. When they finally reached the altar, Mr. Lee stopped, his face glowing with joy despite his obvious frailty. He turned to Wyon, gently squeezing her hand. "This is the happiest day of my life," he said softly, his voice trembling with emotion. Wyon smiled under the veil, her voice steady. "Mine too, Appa." Mr. Lee guided her hand toward Taehyung. "Take care of my daughter," he said, his tone firm despite the kindness in his eyes. Taehyung glanced at the older man, his face unreadable, and nodded curtly. As Mr. Lee stepped back, Taehyung's eyes, almost against his will, shifted to the woman standing in front of him. For the first time, he truly noticed her. Her veil shielded her face, but something about her presence felt different, strange. It nodded him, though he quickly pushed the thought aside, masking it with indifference. The priest cleared his throat, beginning the ceremony. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Lee Wai and KIMTAEHYUNG in holy matrimony." Taehyung barely heard the words as he stood stiffly, nodding at the right moments. Wyon, on the other hand, listened intently, her calm demeanor unshaken. "Do you, KIMTAEHYUNG, take Lee Wai in to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for better or worse, till death do you part?" Taehyung's voice was steady, but his gaze lingered on Wyon's veiled face. "I do." The priest turned to Wyon. "Do you, Lee Wyon, take KIMTAEHYUNG to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for better or worse, till death do you part?" Wyon smiled softly under the veil. "I do. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may now kiss the bride." Taehyung hesitated for a fraction of a second. He reached out, his long fingers delicately lifting the veil. His breath hitched as his eyes met hers. She was breathtaking. Her flawless skin, sparkling eyes, and the soft curve of her lips stunned him. For the first time, the infamous KIMTAEHYUNG, Mafia King and Ruthless leader, felt his heart skip a beat. Wyon's gaze locked with his, and for a moment, the world around them disappeared. It was just the two of them, lost in a silent conversation that neither could explain. Ahem, the priest coughed, breaking the spell. The room erupted in laughter, but Taehyung ignored them. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against Wyon's forehead. She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his touch. Then, without breaking eye contact, Taehyung lowered his head and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was soft, yet it sent a ripple through the crowd, who burst into cheers and whistles. Wyon, though taken aback for a second, smirked inwardly at the intensity of his gaze. So he isn't as indifferent as he pretends to be. When the ceremony ended, Taehyung escorted her down the aisle. His hand rested lightly on her back, but his eyes never left her face. Wyon noticed, of course. She could feel his attention, the way his sharp gaze softened ever so slightly. Smirking secretly, she thought, "This is going to be more interesting than I thought." The crowd dispersed slowly after the ceremony, leaving the bride and groom standing together near the grand staircase of the Kim mansion. Mr. Lee, his cane steadying him, approached his daughter with a bittersweet smile. Wyon immediately stepped forward, her eyes glistening as she clung to her father's arm. "Appa." Mr. Lee cupped her face gently, his voice trembling but warm. "My princess, this is your new beginning. I've done everything I could to make sure you'll be safe and happy. Appa, you've done more than enough." "I'll be fine," Wyon assured him, though her voice quivered with unspoken emotion. Mr. Lee chuckled softly, his thumb brushing away a tear threatening to fall from her eye. "You've always been strong, my Hwayun, but remember, it's okay to lean on someone sometimes, even if that someone is." He trailed off, glancing briefly at Taehyung, who stood a few feet away, his expression unreadable. Hwayun glanced at Taehyung too, then back at her father. "I'll remember that, Appa, but you know me, I can handle anything." She hugged him tightly, inhaling the familiar scent that had always brought her comfort. Mr. Lee held her as if memorizing the feel of his daughter, his frailty more evident in that moment. "I'll miss you, my little girl." "I'll miss you more, Appa," Hwayun whispered, her tears soaking into his suit. After a long pause, he stepped back, his smile bittersweet. "Go on now. Your new life awaits." Taehyung approached then, his usual cold demeanor intact. He nodded curtly to Mr. Lee, who placed a hand on his shoulder. "Take care of her," Mr. Lee said firmly. Taehyung returned the gaze, his expression hard to read. "I will." Mr. Lee gave a small, satisfied nod before turning to Hwayun, and one last time. "Be happy, Hwayun. That's all I've ever wanted for you." As the couple moved toward the sleek black car waiting for them, Hwayun leaned closer to Mr. Kim, whispering something in his ear. Mr. Kim nodded solemnly, murmuring something back. Taehyung's sharp eyes narrowed as he caught the interaction. He didn't ask but made a mental note to keep an eye on whatever secrets were being exchanged. Once seated in the car, Taehyung leaned back in the leather seat, his face impassive. Hwayun settled beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The car's engine roared to life, and they started moving. Silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the faint sound of the car's tires on the pavement. Suddenly, Taehyung's phone buzzed in his pocket. He fished it out, glancing at the screen. The name Yeji flashed, and his jaw tightened. Without hesitation, he declined the call. Hwayun, noticing from the corner of her eye, arched a brow but said nothing. Moments later, the phone buzzed again. Taehyung declined it once more, irritation creeping into his expression. When it buzzed a third time, he exhaled sharply. "Put it on flight mode," Hwayun said casually, her tone holding a hint of amusement as she stared out the window. Taehyung's gaze snapped to her, studying her face for a long moment. He didn't respond but, to her mild surprise, did exactly as she suggested, switching the phone to flight mode and placing it back in his pocket. Hwayun smirked inwardly. "Hell, that was easier than I thought." The rest of the ride passed in silence, Taehyung staring out his window, lost in thought, while Hwayun played with the hem of her dress, her mind swirling with plans of her own.